Welcome everyone to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained. Um, as you can see, this is a MYFAROG presentation of Fair Winds and Bloody Shores, Episode One. And just a little disclaimer: I actually ran Episode One with a single character, a single player who goes by Horik Halfgal of Garrison. Uh, he and I played this session of the game sometime last weekend, and what happened was that the recording didn't actually go through. Um, for some reason, it just got lost in lost someplace on my computer, and I couldn't relocate it, or it didn't record properly. So instead, what I'm going to do is because we're playing this Sunday, and we're going to pick up where we left off. I wanted to give a preview, and then he can jump on and add any commentary he wishes to this video once it's posted. So we ran the adventure, which I had written, Fair Winds and Bloody Shores, and just to give you some background information on the adventure itself. And actually, I can go through and talk about the actual writing process and the different the aspects. So you'll actually hear in this video, both my perception of how the adventure was supposed to come out, and then because I did take notes and I recall what he actually did during the session. Um, I can give you an overview of how things turned out, as far as what was expected, and then how they actually turned out as unexpected. So, very briefly, the adventure I used to writing this adventure, I used the core rule book, which is the 2.6 version of it. I used Curses and Gifts, which is a supplement. I used Travels and Treasures, which is also a supplement. Do Ex Machina, a supplement. And then the Coming for MYFAROG, which is a supplement that introduces, even though it's set in a modern setting or a post-apocalyptic setting, that was the first booklet that produced or brought into the system the idea of flaws, and then a mental health system, which will actually become part of more so part of part two than the player encountered in part one. So the player character's name was Najal, and this adventure begins in the town or village of Grand Meadow in the island region of Prithinio. And so, it starts off, with an introductory. So I read to the player the introduction scene. So it's a clear skied summer afternoon in Grand Meadow, Prithinio. The town is a typical port town on the eastern shoreline of the island, and before the character laid the open waters of the Dawn Sea. So what I had the player do was we had to determine, basically where he was from, which he actually had a character from that particular region anyway. So although it didn't take place in a town that he was born in, it certainly made sense of why he would be there. Once again, his character's name is Najal, which is Njall, and I fairly young, male warrior type character. I believe 18 years old, and just breaking out, just getting out. He was actually a level 2 character, so he had some experience under his belt, and he's just traveling around his region looking for adventure. So, and so I placed him in a town, and a system that I created for the game is a carousal system. And so he had to roll to see how many days he was actually in the village before the adventure began. And, so he rolled a d4 and ended up that he was there for 3 days before the actual adventure would begin. And the carousal system is basically a foraging check, but it's in a town setting or a city setting rather than in a wilderness setting. And so he rolled, and I believe he had two successful rolls on the chart. So the carousal roll was a base DD8, which is like a difficulty setting of an 8. You rolled 3d6, and he was successful on 2 of those subsequent rolls. And what he could have done is he could have found a useful item of minor value through scavenging through, various drums, or, garbage or waste areas, or, just finding something that was discarded. And he discovered a bronze a bronze short sword in fairly decent condition, but bronze not being the ideal weapon material, since it's an Iron Age, setting. But he still kept it. He still decided, I'll hold on to it because you never know, you might, have need of a backup weapon. And characters in MYFAROG don't really start out with you know, a huge amount of equipment to begin with. And then his second successful roll, he discovered I like a game of chance. And so he was in a tavern and he saw this game, and there was the opportunity for him to jump in to the game and actually check out the game. And I used a historical game, which is either Mia or Maya. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced, but it's a dice rolling game, and I kind of laid out some of the rules for it. Had to change it up a little bit because the game doesn't quite have the same mechanics as the real game has. So I modified it to allow them to be able to play it. So the character then had to, he's looking for work. He's in a port town, and the weather is progressively getting, as each day goes by, the skies are getting a little bit clearer, and all of the weather that the player encountered, up to the point that he's in the adventure right now, was actually rolled. Starting from, I randomly checked what season, and what month of the season the story was going to take place, and then I did the various skill checks and everything. Because he was going to be on a ship, it was important to find out wind directions and wind strengths, and how that would actually impact the story going forward. So once again, he was in a tavern looking for work, and he had to make several rolls in order to discover, if there was any work out there. And then once he identified he had a seamanship skill, and so he used that because he was looking to gain passage as a crew member on a ship that was either traveling for purposes of trade, or traveling for purposes of adventure. And so he caught wind of the potential of getting onto a raiding ship of a local, like, well-known sea raider by the name of Torvik Greyhand, and he made contact with either the quartermaster or like an assistant quartermaster in the tavern. He had to make a charisma check in order to secure a position on the ship, and then he would set off the next morning on that ship. Once on the ship, we started going through several checks. Every 6 hours, the weather was checked on, and the events would change based on the success rolls. Now, again, he had seamanship, so he had some skill in working on the ship, and because of his physical aspects of the character, he was tall and lean and agile. And with his skills and everything, he became like an ideal candidate for working the rigging of the boat. And so he had to make those seamanship checks. And the whole time that he was making the checks, he was being evaluated by the ship's captain, and so the quality of his rolls became part of a later on a charisma check, and the player had actually done quite well, making I believe it was looks like 4 out of 5 checks he was able to make, and some of them quite exceptional, and so that kind of set up his next charisma check when he spoke to the captain for the first time directly. During their voyage, during the first voyage, or the first part of their voyage, they did encounter a ship, and it was basically a pirate hunter, and the ship was larger than the ship that the player character was on, and the player character was part of a 3-ship group, and so ultimately they had the advantage in having multiple ships and greater number overall, but the one ship, the pirate hunter ship, was a much larger and probably better staffed ship as well. And so the player character became in charge of a group of 5 NPCs. And basically, the way that I handle mass combat in MYFAROG is that I'll have the player character makes the rolls, the initiative roll, and the his or her attack rolls, and based on the quality and the performance of the player character will determine the outcomes for the NPCs in his charge. So you can actually handle a mass combat situation by just looking at the very micro impact of the player and his character, and then you just expand it to cover the numbers and everything. And so he went through this combat, and he did once again he did fairly well. I mean, he was making decent rolls initially, the very first round of combat. So he was playing a defensive role. They were going to try to prevent a boarding action, but the very first action was an arrow volley that he had and his group had to withstand, and one of his 5-member NPC members was killed instantly, having been struck by 3 arrows simultaneously, and the guy was just killed straight out, outright dead. And then the rest of his group was forced to make a morale check, including the player character. And, fortunately for them, they had made their morale check, because if they had failed that, they would have had subsequently, negatives to every roll that they had to make, for anywhere from a minimum of 1 round to as many as 6 rounds. And combat actions generally don't last, generally don't last a total of, 6 rounds. They go much faster. I believe, if I can piece it together, I mean, this particular round, I see some people took damage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This actually battle took about 6 rounds total. So there was a potential of having negatives throughout the entire battle. And the end result was it was the player character was really facing a legionnaire, a trained soldier, and then a group of 5 warriors against the player character and his group of 5 warriors. And after 6 rounds of combat, the player took some, a light bleeding wound to the leg, and he had lost 2 of his group of 5, and the other 3 had taken some injuries, in some cases some minor injuries. And on the other side, the player character, Najal, actually killed his opponent, and along with 3 of the other 3 of his 5 NPCs. So once the once the session was coming to an end, and we kind of extrapolated what the what the overall action was, and we kind of extended it out to all of the the other ships and the other outcomes, we were able to determine that, all right, well, this is how, if we followed through, this is how the battle would have turned out. And so we brought it to an end, and experience points were awarded. And the way the experience points was awarded was, it was based on not each individual role like MYFAROG, the core rule books actually call for. What we did instead, or what I did instead, was I looked at the story and looked at the parts of the story. And so based on the player's effectiveness during each of those parts, ended up giving him a series of successes in the story mode of it, and about 300 experience points, which kind of hits the average that I've seen in some other other games being run. And it comes out to about 100 experience points per hour of gameplay. And it just so happened that it kind of matched that, pretty closely. When I say I've seen it in other game systems, that's pretty much how experience points works in Conan RPG as well. So roughly 100 points per hour of gameplay. And so we had wrapped it up. We had some other technical difficulties which forced the adventure to come to a reasonable close at the time. I mean, we had completed a major story element of the adventure anyway, so it did make sense to end it there anyhow. And that session lasted about 2 hours and maybe 25 minutes or so. So the adventure when we pick it up now for part 2, which will be on Sunday, and so I'll be posting that sometime Sunday afternoon or evening. That will pick up where it left off. There might even be the potential of another player joining in, and so where the scenario is is picking up again, it'll make it very easy to bring in another player character, because all he has to do is come from one of the other 2 ships, and so he can easily be placed on board with Najal, the character, and we can go forward from there. So once again, unfortunately, the original video of the game session wasn't able to do, but hopefully this preview of the of the game, and kind of a step-by-step walkthrough of how the adventure turned out for part 1 will at least encourage you to look into part 2 as well. So I'm waiting for the player to join in, and in the comments section, so he can add or correct anything that I might have gotten wrong. He can also add a little bit background information about his character if he wishes to, and then that will make it a smooth transition, or a smoother transition, into episode 2 of this presentation of Fair Winds, Bloody Shores, a MYFAROG adventure. All right, well, thanks for joining in, and happy gaming, and I look forward to seeing your comments on the YouTube channel, and hopefully in the future we'll get to meet up with some of you, and get some of the other games going that we're looking to put together. All right, you have a good weekend.